Hello, we are moving into the 7th week of our course with this topic, Modernist Poetry. We give a brief introduction to Modernist Poetry and then subsequently we will discuss a few poets and their poems. In this lecture, we will provide a historical and literary context, identify the features of Modernist poetry, discuss these features one after another like rejection of the past, influence of symbolist poetry, Imagism, vorticism, and the chief practitioners of this Modernist poetry, Pound, H.T., that is Hilda Doolittle and Eliot. We also have war poetry in this period, so we will spend some time on war poetry and a poet called Siegfried Sassoon. Then other features like disorientation and obscurity, imagistic and mythical coherence. Finally, we will look at a sample modernist poem from proper British literature. The blast is a cover that we have for the magazine that was published by Pound and his colleague Wyndham Lewis. In this magazine, one of the first poems on preludes was published by T.S. Eliot. When we pay attention to the historical context, we find that two monarchs have ruled the early part of 20th century, King Edward VII and King George V. So, we have Edwardian period and Georgian period in terms of literary periodization. But the decisive event of this early 20th century is this First World War between 1914 and 1918. Later on we have this Second World War as well from 1939 to 1945. We also have some other influential events affecting British life and society, that is Irish Revolt and independence from Britain in 1922. On the periphery we also have this Russian Revolution in 1917. And in all these events, we have large scale death and destruction of people and property. Therefore, people could not identify a controlling center or authority. They found the center was deteriorating, the center was losing its power. As a result, people became disoriented, particularly writers felt affected by these events. As a result, we also have fragmented perceptions and also of lives. This pushed people to go for alternative models of understanding life. Now, let us see the literary context of modernist poetry. We have first symbolist poetry from Mallarmé, Verlaine, Rimbaud, Lafog. These are all French poets. Actually, this is called French symbolism, which influenced British poetry. We Libre, and then the most important aspect of this symbolist poetry is attention to impressions of inner life. That is what we find in many modernist poets. Then we have Edwardian poetry at this time represented by A. Houseman, Thomas Hardy, Edward Thomas, and these poets and many others of this Edwardian period were talking about loss of old values, and they were thinking about the past, recollecting the old values of the past in their nostalgic poems. Then we have Georgian poetry represented by John Masefield, Walter de la Mare, and these poets were looking at life sentimentally from rural perspectives and also romantic perspectives. So, we have to remember that many modes of poetry were concurrently available at this period. Against these kinds of poetry, we have modernist poetry in imagist poems and vorticist poems. First by Pound, Hilda Doolittle, they were paying attention to precise image in their poems. Then Pound moved on to vorticism with his colleague Wyndham Lewis, and they gave importance to direct treatment of objects, things, people, emotions. And We also have, as we mentioned earlier, war poetry during this period, soldiers who participated in the First World War like Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen, and they were all talking about this futility of war. What is the use of war when this war involves so many deaths without much meaning? And then we have proper modernist poetry in W.B. Yeats, T.S. Eliot, Pound and others, and they were all discussing modernist chaotic life in their poems. We have some key texts like Yeats's The Second Coming and Eliot's The Wasteland. We will discuss these poems in our course. We also have some key lines from these poems like things fall apart, the center cannot hold, and then from Eliot's poem a heap of broken images. There is no whole, there is no center, there is no unifying factor for society, for people, and so this was a fractured life that poets and people were living during this period. Certain features of modernist poetry we can find here from a critic called Hulme. We have listed them here from rejection of the past. Past here means Victorian and Romantic poetry. We also mentioned about this Edwardian and Georgian poetry. This modernist poetry was highly experimental. It used symbolism, imagism, vorticism, and also it used other cultures like Indian, Chinese and Japanese. That is a kind of alternative mode of life that poets were trying to look for themselves. A key feature of this modernist poetry is fragmentation, a heap of broken images. Complete disorientation was found among these poets and people. They could not have any kind of cultural religious moorings, and so many people became hopeless and desperate, and this disorientation and despair we find well exemplified in this kind of modernist poetry. This disorientation and despair led to what is known as obscurity in poetry. This well known poem The Wasteland was the first annotated poem in English literature. The poem was annotated by the poet himself for the benefit of others to make some sense out of this poem. And what we have in this poem and many other poems is juxtaposition of contrary images and ideas without links among them, without explicit connection among them. That is where the readers have difficulty in understanding these poems. However, these poets have attempted to give some kind of internal coherence through myths and musical phrases in some sequences. We will see certain features of these poems in our course. Now, let us start with this rejection of the past. Modernist poets rejected both the form and content of traditional poetry. Edwardian poetry, Georgian poetry, Victorian poetry and Romantic poetry. Everything that was traditional in terms of form and theme they rejected. These modernist poets did not find meaning in old values and modes because these old values and modes did not prevent the First World War. They also abandoned rhymes and fixed forms which were available at that time. They experimented with language to express images and ideas directly and precisely. They employed free verse extensively. They also explored the inner life of human beings as subjectively as they could. They used techniques from other arts like painting, sculpture, architecture, even film. Two techniques are very commonly used in this kind of modernist poetry. One is collage and another is montage. Montage from film and collage from various kinds of arts. When we come to symbolism, we find that the French symbolist movement was popular at the end of the 19th century and it aimed at a highly personal form of expression. The symbolist poets used carefully chosen words to suggest deeper meanings through tones, colors and harmonies. So, we can see some kind of influence of painting here as well. They exploited the inherent ambiguity in symbols which do not show links between images and ideas explicitly, leading to the difficulty for readers. They also experimented with free verse, open forms without restrictions. They focused on the inner life of human beings, not the outer forms through descriptions of nature or outer objects. This kind of symbolist poetry was pioneered in France by Mallarmé, Vallon, Rimbaud, Laforgue. All these writers, French writers, influenced Yeats, Eliot and other modernist poets profoundly. One example we have here in Yeats, that is his poems like Byzantium and Sailing to Byzantium are good examples for symbolist poetry, which is part of modernist poetry. A remarkable feature of modernist poetry is this concentration on image, which came to be called Imagism. It is a transatlantic literary movement based in London. It was led by writers like T. E. Hulme, F. S. Flint, Joseph Campbell and many others. The main aim of this Imagist movement was to communicate reality directly without fixed forms. They also attempted to promote free verse experimentally. The best example for Imagism is the poem by Ezra Pound called In a Station of the Metro, just 2-line poem. We will see that when we come to Ezra Pound. 3 rules of Imagism were mentioned during this time. We have listed them here. One is direct treatment of the thing, the second is accurate presentation, that means no excessive use of words as we see in no verbiage. The third one is composition in a sequence of musical phrases. So, we can understand that these modernist poets were using free verse, but at the same time they were giving importance to music, rhythm and many other aspects associated with good poetry. According to Pound, an image presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time. That is very important for Pound and many other modernist poets. Earlier we know that the best word in the best order creates the best poem, but according to Pound and others in this group, we find that the best image in the best order creates the best poetry, that is modernist poetry. Finally, the burden of understanding the poem is on the reader. The reader has to interpret the images and make sense, and that is where they had a lot of difficulties. Because of this, poets like Eliot had to pitch in and provide annotations for the poems that they wrote. Vorticism is an offshoot of Imagism. Pound found that Imagism was misused by some poets, so he wanted to distinguish himself from Imagism by moving on to the next stage called vorticism. This vorticist movement started with the launch of the magazine called Blast in this violet color, as we showed the picture earlier, in 1914, and it was edited by Wyndham Lewis and Ezra Pound. The aim of this vorticism was to destroy old literary and social conventions. It was indebted to the futurist, the Italian futurist called F.T. Marinetti, who valued speed, technology and power. So, we can understand the influence of technology, power, speed through this futurist movement on vorticism and modernist poetry in general. Wyndham Lewis identified 3 features of vorticism: 1. activity, 2. significance and 3rd essential movement. All these were identified in vorticism, and the most important aspect of vorticism is of course image from Imagism, but here we have a specific image for this vorticism, that is a whirlpool of human imagination and potentialities, and this vorticist point is the point of maximum energy according to Pound. Vorticism presented the reality of the present. It also created a new taste among readers. We have some poets, writers and artists. Pound and Eliot are good examples for poets, and Rebecca West, Ford Madox Ford are good examples for writers, and then we have many artists like Edward Wordsworth, Jacob Epstein, Spencer Gore and Wyndham Lewis himself. A very good poem for this vorticist movement is Eliot's poem called Preludes. The leader of modernist movement is of course Ezra Pound. He was an American born poet, but he primarily lived in Europe, promoting new talents with his slogans like "Make it new" and "Destroy the world." He appreciated the Japanese haiku for its concentration. He also identified the juxtaposition of nature and man in Chinese poetry and also Japanese poetry. He changed a nameless urban crowd into a beautiful object in his most famous poem called "In a Station of the Metro." It is an example of this Imagist poetry and also this vorticist poetry. This is a short poem of 2 lines like haiku. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. What we have here in this poem is clarity and precision of language. We have images, faces through petals, crowd through wet and black bough. Originally this 2-line poem had many lines, but later on these were reduced to 3 stanzas, and finally we have just a 2-line poem like a Japanese haiku or a Chinese pictogram. The next writer is Hilda Doolittle. Hilda Doolittle is also an American. She was attracted to these conflicting natural forces. She followed the principles of Imagism very carefully. That is why she is more often associated with Pound than with many other poets who were initially following Imagism, as represented by Amy Lowell. She infused an energy not seen in Pound and also F.S. Flint. She achieved complexity by a dynamic interaction of images in a moment. We have an example from her poem called Oread. Oread means a sea nymph. Let us read this small poem. Wallop sea, whirl you pointed pines, splash your great pines on your rocks, hurl your green over us, cover us with your pools of fur. What we have in this poem is a unified image for the sea and the land. Those of you who may have seen the connections would understand it much better. When you see the trees, when you see the clouds, you will have something like an image of waves. Now you can see a wave of traffic on roads as well. The dynamic force created by the active verbs can be seen in this poem: whirl, whirl, splash, hurl, cover. Such power is the heart of vorticist, imagist, modernist poetry. We come to T.S. Eliot now, one of the most influential poets and critics of 20th century. He was groomed by Pound in a world of futility and anarchy. He published his poem Preludes in Blast in 1915. A poem on the chaotic modern city is Preludes. It juxtaposes the clock time with the internal time. We have 4 sections in this poem about evening, dawn, morning and again evening. The same days and actions of anonymous hands and feet are picturized in this poem. The mental landscape of the speaker and the outer scene are juxtaposed in this poem, focusing on the loneliness, alienation and isolation of the modern city. Specifically, we have the image of a woman in the soul of the speaker. Probably the preludes can refer back to the prelude by Wordsworth. By this kind of association, we can see how Eliot is rejecting Victorian and Romantic style or substance of poetry. We have the first stanza here as a sample of modernist poetry for us from Preludes. The winter evening settles down with smell of sticks in passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet and newspapers from vacant lots. The showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street a lonely cab horse steams and stamps, and then the lighting of the lamps. An evening is captured in this poem, and newspapers from vacant lots is just one image we have drawn attention to, but the whole poem is built on several images like the burnt out ends of smoky days, and now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet. So, building of images one after another is the crux of this modernist poetry. These images are objective correlatives for the internal emotions felt by the poet or the speaker or other people of this time. As we said, war poetry is a key aspect of this modernist poetry because war happened during this period, and the war poetry also focused on the meaninglessness, the futility, the despair, the disorientation of modern life. War poetry in this context generally refers to the poets who participated in the First World War as soldiers primarily. However, we also have some poets writing about the First World War, those who may not have participated in this. This First World War had a profound impact on soldier poets and the public. We have something like 70 war poets, including 50 soldier poets. That means they were soldiers, they participated in the war in some way or the other. They expressed anger, disgust and horror openly in their poems. They said there was nothing noble about the traumatic trench warfare. We have this example in Rupert Brooke, Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. They adapted the rhythms and technology of a machine war. We have Brooke's The Soldier. This poem initially was idealistic, it was appreciating, praising war, but then later on Brooke changed his opinion. Similarly, Sassoon also initially was writing about the war and later on became more and more realistic. Here we have an example in Counter Attack, but the best war poetry is represented by Wilfred Owen, and there are many poems. Here we have mentioned one, And Them for the Doomed Youth. It is more surrealistic. So, we differentiate the three poets by these terms: idealistic, realistic and surrealistic. Owen's unique position in war poetry was achieved by his use of alliteration, onomatopoeia, assonance, half rhyme and many other poetic techniques. So, he became a unique poet. He occupied a unique position in war poetry in general. Let us pay attention to Siegfried Sassoon. He wrote war poetry before and after the war. He started his career as a poet in the conventional format. He employed nature images and abstract meditations. Here we have two examples, Absolution and To My Brother. Later on, when the intensity of war increased, when he saw many deaths, he changed his treatment of war and the dead. He then began to expose the indignity and inhumanity of death in war. Most important thing that he did was to publish Owen's poems. Owen wrote poems and sent them to Sassoon, and he did not publish many of his poems during his own lifetime. These were published after his death in the battlefield. Sassoon got into trouble by an open letter to the War Department, and so he was considered unpatriotic and put into a lot of trouble. It was Robert Graves, another poet, who saved Siegfried Sassoon at this time. Sassoon captured the disorientation of war in a poem which we referred to earlier called Counter Attack. Here we have two lines from this poem. A naked sodden buttocks, mats of hair bulged, clotted head slept in the plastering slime. We can see the image of destruction, death, disorientation, despair in these just two lines written by a war poet. Now we specifically move on to the disorientation and despair, as a feature of modernist poetry. There was a sense of being rootless and anchorless among the poets and the people. There was the failure, the utter failure of religion and other social institutions. They could not prevent the war, they could not prevent the destruction. Actually, many such destructions have come about in the name of religion and other social institutions like nation and nationhood. At this time, we have the discovery of the unconscious and its effect on human beings by Freud. We also have this relativism and amorality of scientific knowledge from Einstein. The impact of the rapid changes in science and technology were also seen. We also notice the impact of the rapid changes in science and technology at this time, leading to mechanical and mechanized age of dehumanized self. People were isolated, lonely and alienated, and so these are called modern human beings, completely losing contact with themselves and with others. They broke race, class, gender and other hierarchies, and we have man as a money making and soul killing agent. That is the most distressing part of this modern life. So, people became disoriented and they became desperate, and naturally the poets of this period give expression to the disorientation and despair of the times. Because of this disorientation, poets could not write poems with some clear meaning for the reader. The reader had to find the meaning. Even today, readers will have to struggle hard to understand modernist poetry. Why? Because they used foreign language words and phrases excessively in their poems. They had obscure historical and cultural references. They also had uncommon literary allusions which we cannot easily locate. They also wrote poems just like quotations, putting them together without quotation marks. That is where we have these techniques called montage, collage and mosaic. What we have here is a fusion leading to confusion, fusion by the poet and confusion for the reader. That is what we have in this modernist poetry. The stance taken by these writers is ironic, therefore their poetry is ambiguous and their poems are open-ended texts. They used a fractured language to represent their fractured experience, and to represent this experience they used images without explicit connections. In general, there is a kind of charge against modernist poetry, that is, this modernist poetry had elitist attitude and outlook. For example, we have one instance of this obscurity here in the wasteland. We have a quotation from German, and we have the translation here. I am not Russian at all, I come from Lithuania, a true German. This, when we have in a poem which is written in English, suddenly all readers who may not understand German will not have any clue at all to understand what this is all about. And when it comes to images, we have this fusion of images and ideas, and so we have split this word confusion, co-fusion of images, confusion of images. These images represent the confused life of modern people. These writers paired the past and the present. For example, Eliot gave such a kind of idea in his own essay, critical essay called Tradition and the Individual Talent, by referring to this historical sense. We have a mix of literary and artistic forms, collision of languages and literatures. So, we have many kinds of languages and literatures in modernist poetry. One of the statements of Eliot also we have to remember at this time, that is, the modernist poet will have to bring the entire European literature and life, culture in general, into his poem. We have this juxtaposition of images and ideas without explicit linking markers, leading to difficulties. Modernist poets explored literature, history, religion, myth. That means they were not just writing poems, they were writing poems in relation to many other cultural factors like history, religion, myth. They investigated the linguistic medium much more seriously than poets who came before. And as a result of all this, what they achieved was instantaneity, simultaneity and contemporaneity of experience, expression, everything in their poem. Just because they had despair and disorientation, it does not mean that these poems had coherence at all. We have some organizing principle identified by Eliot, that is called mythical and musical organization. Eliot wrote a review of James Joyce's novel, another modernist novel, that is Ulysses, in an essay Ulysses, Order and Myth, which was published in the magazine called The Dial. So, in this review, Eliot himself gives clues for us to understand the organizing principles. Eliot says, myth is a way of controlling or ordering or giving a shape and a significance to the immense panorama of futility and anarchy which is contemporary history. James Joyce used the myth of Ulysses from Greek culture. Eliot also has used the kingfisher myth in his poem The Wasteland. So, the myth of Ulysses we find in James Joyce's Ulysses, and the myth of the Holy Grail we find in Eliot's The Wasteland. Further, we also have improvisation techniques for coherence. These improvisations happen through repetitions of words, phrases, images, ideas, emotions, even rhythms, by extending their significance from the beginning to the end. So, throughout these texts what we have is points and counterpoints, and then finally taking a good shape, which of course the reader will have to find for himself or herself. Here we have a sample modernist poem. This is written by T. Hulme. It is called The Embankment, and we have something like a subtitle within brackets, The Fantasy of a Fallen Gentleman on a Cold Bitter Night. Once in finesse of fiddles found I ecstasy, in a flash of gold heels and hard pavement. Now see I that warms the very stuff of poesy. O God, make small the old star-eaten blanket of the sky, that I may fold it round me and in comfort lie. What a beautiful image we have in the old star-eaten blanket, which is going to cover this fallen man and giving him some comfort. People suffered a lot. They needed some kind of support or succor, they did not find it. That is why they wrote poems like this. In summary, we have paid attention to the historical and literary context in which modernist poetry was written, and we identified some of the features like rejection of the past, influence of symbolist poetry, the rise of Imagism and vorticism, the chief practitioners of Imagism and vorticism like Pound, Hilda Doolittle, and of course Eliot. In between we found this war poetry also taking the shape of modernist poetry, expressing disorientation and obscurity, and finally we found despite all these kinds of disparate elements, we find some kind of coherence through myth and musical organization, and finally we looked at a sample poem by T. Hulme. We have some references now. Thank you.